No more school, no more books, no more teachers' dirty looks. Those words popped into my head about 3 days ago. I don't remember anything more about them than that. I think they were a rhyme that we used to say when I was a kid, perhaps when school holidays were coming up, and the idea that we'd be free from school for a while. And I guess too, perhaps in a little mature way, when we reach the end of high school and perhaps finish TAFE or university, there can also be a sense of relief then. The idea perhaps that no more exams, don't have to face them anymore. Except that with some careers these days, tests go on being a part of life. Back when I worked in finance, we had monthly reviews to see how our section was going and how the office was going and so forth. I'm just reading an autobiography by one of Australia's cricketers at the moment, and he was talking about the joy to get into the Australian Test team, but then finding that all the time you judged on your batting scores, for instance, and always that worry, have I done enough, have I scored enough, am I in the team or am I not in the team? Now, that's the way things happen, and maybe you've got it in your job, the idea that somebody's watching over you, checking on you, seeing how well you're going. And what this comes down to, among other things, is are you a worker or are you a shirker? I don't know if you're familiar with that word, shirker, or to shirk, but it's somebody who dodges work. I was reading again this autobiography by a cricketer, and he was saying when he moved to Perth to play there, they gave them a run to do around the city of Perth, and two of the players stopped off somewhere, waited for the rest of the team to come round, and when the rest of the team got back, they got back out and ran the rest of the way. They were shirking. That's the idea there of the word. And today I want to talk about a parable that involves two workers and a shirker. And that is the parable of the talents, which is recorded in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 right down to verse 30. But before we get into that, I just want to look at the background. Back in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus tells four of his disciples about a coming time of judgment. And I plan to look at that passage in this morning's adult class. The indications are that in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is talking about the fall of Jerusalem to the Roman army, which was going to occur in AD 70, about 40 years after Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and ascension. But that's not the only case of judgment that we find in the Bible. Jerusalem was going to face judgment because of its sinfulness. Well, Jerusalem faced judgment in the Old Testament because of its sinfulness. The northern kingdom of Israel faced judgment. Countries like Assyria, Egypt, Babylon faced God's judgment. Cities like Tyre and Sidon faced judgment. Sodom and Gomorrah faced judgment. And here in the New Testament, there are repeated statements about the fact that there will be a final judgment. Paul, for instance, in Acts chapter 17, when he was speaking to the philosophers gathered there in the city of Athens, said this in Acts 17 and verse 30, Having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now proclaiming to mankind that all people everywhere are to repent, because he has set a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness, and will do so through Jesus Christ. So, coming back to the book of Matthew, Matthew chapter 24, Matthew there has recorded Jesus warning about judgment, and then going on to chapter 25, Matthew records three of Jesus' parables, and each one of them deals with judgment. There's the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13, where Jesus uses the illustration of a wedding feast. There's the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, verses 14 down to 30, where Jesus uses finances as an illustration. And then there's the parable of the sheep and goats in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 46, where Jesus uses judgment and deeds, or lack of deeds, as an illustration. And it's the parable of the talents that I want to focus on, beginning in Matthew 25 and verse 14. A parable is basically a story which illustrates a spiritual principle. And these parables, these stories, often dealt with situations that people were familiar with. They were fairly realistic situations. So here in Matthew 25 and verse 14, we've got a wealthy man who is going away for a time. For it is just like a man about to go on a journey, who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. To the one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, each according to his own ability. And he went on his journey. So he entrusts different amounts to 3 servants or slaves. 5 talents, 2 talents, 1 talent. And you think, well, that's not fair on the 1 talent man. Actually, as we're going to see, that's still a substantial amount. The master understood the abilities of his servants, and so he allocated amounts to them based on their abilities, so that none of them would feel overwhelmed, unable to handle the responsibility. Now, we today, when we talk about a talent, we think of an ability. But here in the scriptures back then, a talent was a large sum of money. Its value based on the metal that was involved, for instance, whether gold or silver. Now, if you go back to Matthew chapter 20, you've got the parable of the labourers there, and on the basis of that parable, it is thought that a Roman coin, the denarius, was the general daily wage for a labourer. Well, according to a chart that I've got at home, a talent was worth 6,000 times the value of a denarius, 6,000 days' wages. So the 5-talent servant received the equivalent of almost 96 years' wages. This is based on a 6-day working week. The 2-talent servant received the equivalent of just over 38 years' wages. The 1-talent servant received the equivalent of just over 19 years' wages. So he still had a substantial responsibility. If you want to put it in round figures that are easier to remember, you can say the 5-talent man had roughly 100 years' wages. The 2-talent man had roughly 40 years' wages, and the 1-talent man had roughly 20 years' wages. Well, what do they do with them? Verse 16, the one who had received the 5 talents immediately went and did business with them and earned 5 more talents. So he doubled his master's money. Verse 17, in the same way, the one who had received the 2 talents earned 2 more. So he likewise doubled his master's money. Verse 18, but he who received the 1 talent went away and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. He did nothing. So eventually the master returns. First he speaks to the 2 servants who have done well. Verse 19, now after a long time the master of the slaves came and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 talents came up and brought 5 more talents, saying, Master, you entrusted 5 talents to me. See, I have earned 5 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter the joy of your master. Also, the one who had received the 2 talents came up and said, Master, you entrusted 2 talents to me. See, I've earned 2 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You were faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter the joy of your master. So they've done well. Showed that they were capable of handling their responsibilities. But then we come to servant number 3. What you'll notice here is he puts all the blame on the master. He accepts no responsibility himself. Verse 24, now the one who had received the 1 talent also came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter seed. And I was afraid, so I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, you still have what is yours. So what was he? Shirker. The other 2 were capable of dealing with their responsibility, but not number 3. His master answered, verse 26, and said to him, you worthless, lazy slave. Did you know that I reap where I did not sow and scatter and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore take the talent away from him and give it to the one who has the 10 talents. And then verse 30, throw the worthless slave into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So basically he got the sack. He was dismissed. Why? Because he didn't take responsibility. If you might say, well, maybe he didn't have the same ability. The master's allowed for that. Gave him 1 talent, but he couldn't even handle that. Now, there's a couple of other points to notice here. If you notice in verse 27, where the master says to this 1 talent servant, you ought to have put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. He's saying, at least you could have done that. Now, you might have it in mind, as I did, that, the Jews couldn't charge interest. But if you look at Deuteronomy 23, verses 19 and 20, the Jews were not to charge interest to one another. They were to give to help one another without charging interest. But they could charge interest to foreigners. One writer suggests that rather than being something like the NAB or the Commonwealth Bank, something like that, it wasn't unusual for somebody to put money with a money changer, and the money changers would make a profit on each transaction, and that's how you get interest, by putting your money with a money changer. And so the 1 talent servant could at least have done that, but he didn't even make that effort. The other verse to notice is verse 29. For to everyone who has, more shall be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have will be taken away. And that's referring to the fact that the talent was taken away from the 1 talent servant and given to the one who had the 10 talents now. And the point that is being made there is that those who serve Jesus, serve God faithfully, will be blessed. But those who are lazy, those who are shirkers, will lose whatever little they might have. They'll taste nothing of the blessings which are there. They'll miss out on them completely. And that's what happened in this case. Now, in regard to judgment, Matthew 25, verses 1 to 13, the parable of the 10 virgins, emphasizes the need to be ready, the need to be prepared. 5 of these women were not prepared. The second parable, the parable of the talents, tells us how to be ready or be prepared. How? By getting on and doing something with the opportunities and the resources that we have. Richard T. France, writing in the New Bible Commentary, sums up the parable of the talents by saying that readiness for judgment, quote, is not to be in passive waiting, but in getting on with the job and making the most of the opportunities entrusted to us, unquote. How do we prepare for judgment? We get on, use the time we have, use the opportunities we have, use the resources that we have to serve God and serve others. We do not prepare for judgment by just sitting back and waiting for it to happen. An illustration how to make the most of opportunity to prepare is given in the third of the parables, the parable of the sheep and the goats. You remember here, beginning in Matthew 25 and verse 31, it's talking about when Christ comes in judgment and everybody will be gathered. They'll be divided into 2 groups, the sheep and the goats. And those 2 descriptions are used because of the characteristics of those animals. Then we pick it up in verse 34. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you as a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" The king will answer and say to them, "Truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it for one of these brothers of mine, you did it for me." So how were these prepared for judgment? They'd done what they could with the opportunities and resources they had. They fed the hungry. They gave drink to the thirsty. They were hospitable to strangers. They clothed those who were without clothing. They visited the sick. They visited prisoners, and so forth. They looked around, saw needs, and responded to those needs. Now, this could be a problem for some people, because you might say, well, hang on, we're saved by faith, not by works. We don't earn our salvation. We're saved by God's grace, expressed through the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ and responded to with faith. However, what we've got to understand here is that faith, just like love, is active. It's demonstrated by effort. The book of James we should be fairly familiar with as being a comment on this. You go over to James chapter 2, beginning in verse 14. "What use is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? In the same way, faith also, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself." If you go up to on to verse 20, Are you willing to acknowledge, you foolish person, that faith without works is useless? Verse 25, in the same way, verse 26, for just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. An inactive faith is not true faith. Faith involves putting your trust in somebody or something and acting on that basis. As I said, it's the same sort of principle as we see with love. If you come over to 1 John chapter 3, beginning in verse 16. 1 John 3 and verse 16. I'm looking in 2 Peter, which is why I can't get the right words. 1 John 3 and verse 16. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But whoever has worldly goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God remain in him? Little children, let's not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. And also let's not claim faith just in word, but also in deed. It's like sometimes of an evening, Lavinia will say, oh, I feel like something, I need calcium. A chocolate would be nice. And, you know, me being the dedicated husband, I jump into the car and drive all the way to Aldi and get a chocolate. And get myself something while I'm there. But that's the idea, you know, if we care for somebody, we do something for them. And if we have faith, we do something about that faith. Faith is active. Now, I recognize that there are factors affecting how much we can do at given times, given stages of life. If you've got a situation where two parents are working and commuting and looking after young children, obviously time is restricted there. You don't have perhaps the same ability to get out and go visit people and so forth, although you could still invite somebody to your place, say on a weekend or something like that. The situation is that as you go through the stages of life, you're able to do certain things more at one stage than another. For instance, as you reach retirement age, you've got more of an opportunity there to go out and do things. But we shouldn't have to wait till retirement age. And the point I'm making there too with retirement is that's not an excuse to sit back and say, well, I'm retired, others in the church can do the work. No. We've got opportunity, as I say, at different stages, more opportunities perhaps at some stages than others. But we can always do something as our children get older and are more independent and so forth. Again, we have the opportunity there to get out and to help others. It might be by giving somebody a call. It might be by inviting people home to our house. It might be going and visiting somebody in hospital or whatever. There are always things that we can do. Come over to James chapter 1. The thing is this, we're all at different stages of life. We all have different abilities, different opportunities. If all of us are doing what we can, where we can, for whom we can, then collectively we're going to be getting a lot of things done. James chapter 1 and verse 22, but prove yourselves doers of the word and not just hearers who deceive themselves. Prove yourself doers of the word. And if you look also at verse 25, The one who has looked intently at the perfect law, the law of freedom, and has continued in it, not having become a forgetful hearer, but an active doer, this person will be blessed in what he does. Notice what it's about. It's about being an active person. We hear the word, we read the word, and we get out and we live it. We apply it. If you want an example of somebody like that, you can go back to Acts chapter 9 and read there from verse 36. Acts 9 verse 36. Now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. Joppa, incidentally, was a town on the Mediterranean coast. This woman was excelling in acts of kindness and charity, which she did habitually. But it happened at that time that she became sick and died. When they had washed her body, they laid it in an upstairs room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, having heard that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, "Do not delay in coming to us." So Peter got ready and went with them. When he arrived, they brought him into the room upstairs, and all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. She had an ability with thread and needle, and so she used that ability to help out others, because it says she was excelling in acts of kindness and charity. And that's the same thing with you and I. We've all got abilities. And everybody knows if you've got a problem with your computer, don't call me. If you've got a problem with your car engine, don't call me. But there are other things I can do. I've mowed lawns for 55 years or more. So I can push a lawnmower. And sometimes that comes up. Somebody's not well, somebody needs some help, I'll go and mow their lawn. That's something I can do. With the computer, I've got to ask somebody else. And we're all like that. We've all got abilities. Even with something like cooking. Think, well, there's not much to it. It's straightforward. Okay, put a little bit in, a little bit extra in the next time you're cooking for your family, and you've got an extra meal there that you can share with somebody else. Somebody's sick in the congregation or whatever, you can put that in the freezer, bring it along, or drive it over or whatever one day and help out that way. Or cook a little bit extra and invite somebody home for dinner. We can all do things. God has entrusted things to us. We have incomes, we have houses, we have cars, we have phones, we have computers. We have a range of abilities, a whole range of abilities that we can use. And also, if I can use talent in the modern sense, very few of us are one talent people. Oftentimes there's a range of things that we're able to do. So every one of us can take what God has given to us and put it into use, put it to effect. God has given us these things. God is the one who has blessed us. God is the one who has given us abilities and so forth. We're stewards. Are we going to let these things go to waste and say to God, I couldn't do anything, here's what you gave me, I just buried it, couldn't be bothered doing anything about it? In this congregation, you've all volunteered to help out in various ways in the congregation, and that's great. But there's all sorts of other things too that need doing. People in this congregation are sick. People in various other congregations are sick. And there's other problems from time to time. Opportunities to do something. how are we going to respond to those? There's a song that we sing. I was going to ask Warren if we could lead it, but then I thought I might have asked for this to be led not so long ago, but it's a song, I want to be a worker for the Lord. Now we can get up, we can sing that just like we can sing every other song. But the question is, do we mean it? I want to be a worker. I want to. I'm going to get out there and I'm going to look around and I'm going to be aware of what's going on in people's lives. And if there's an opportunity to help somebody in the congregation or help my neighbor or anybody, I want to be a worker for the Lord. And we work for the Lord by working for the benefit of others, helping others. So that's the message that particularly comes out of Matthew, the 25th chapter. One day we're going to stand before God and we're going to be held accountable for what he has given to us, the opportunities, the resources, the abilities. What are we going to do with these things? Let's stand and sing.